The sound of footsteps on his cabin's wooden porch cut through the mountain silence like a blade through silk. Dr. James Carter froze, his coffee mug halfway to his lips, as the heavy boots approached his front door with the deliberate cadence of authority. Through the kitchen window, he could see two figures in what appeared to be police uniforms, their faces hard and unfamiliar in the golden morning light filtering through the Colorado pines. This was supposed to be his sanctuary. After 30 years as a federal cybersecurity specialist, James had purchased this remote cabin in the Rocky Mountain foothills specifically to escape the constant surveillance and political pressures of his high-security government work. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, the closest town was 45 minutes down a winding mountain road, and the area was supposedly free from HOA interference. The sharp knock that followed was aggressive, demanding, nothing like the respectful tap of genuine law enforcement conducting routine business. James had worked with federal agents, state police, and local sheriffs throughout his career. This felt wrong. Open up, police! Through the window, James studied the two men more carefully. Their uniforms looked authentic at first glance, complete with badges and equipment belts, but something was off. The fabric seemed too new, too crisp like costumes rather than well-worn service gear. More troubling, neither man was displaying the calm professionalism he'd expect from real officers conducting official business. James approached the door cautiously, his instincts honed by decades of government work screaming warnings. "Can I see some identification, officers? We have a warrant to search these premises," the larger man barked, completely ignoring the reasonable request. "Open this door immediately or we'll break it down." "A warrant? For what?" The response was immediate and chilling. "We don't need to show you anything. This is about your illegal structures and environmental violations." Environmental violations? Illegal structures? James's cabin had been professionally inspected and approved by every relevant agency before purchase. He had permits for every modification, certificates for every system, and documentation for every tree that had been removed during construction. But more importantly, environmental violations fell under federal jurisdiction, not something local police would handle with aggressive dawn raids. Through his security system, a sophisticated network he'd installed using his government connections, James could see a white SUV parked at the end of his long driveway. The vehicle looked official, but something about its positioning bothered him. Real police would park closer to the residence for officer safety and operational efficiency. This SUV was positioned like it was ready for a quick escape. "Sir, we know you're in there!" the second man shouted. "This is your final warning!" That's when James noticed the most disturbing detail of all. Neither man was wearing a body camera, standard equipment for any legitimate police operation in Colorado. Their radio equipment looked wrong. Their weapons were positioned incorrectly, and their aggressive behavior violated every protocol he'd ever witnessed in decades of working with law enforcement. James quietly activated his cabin's advanced security recording system and pulled out his encrypted government phone. If these were real police officers conducting a legitimate search, everything would be properly documented through official channels. If they weren't, "Officers, I'm calling the sheriff's department to confirm this warrant," James announced calmly. The reaction was explosive. "You have 30 seconds to open this door, or we're—"
6 months earlier, James Carter had thought he'd found paradise. The cabin sat on 20 pristine acres, surrounded by national forest land, with deed restrictions that supposedly prevented any HOA interference. But paradise, as he was learning, could be invaded by determined adversaries. The trouble had started innocuously enough. Evelyn Morrison, self-appointed guardian of what she called mountain community standards, had introduced herself during his first week of residency. A sharp-faced woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mr. Carter, I represent the Woodland Heights Community Standards Association," she'd announced, standing uninvited on his front porch with a clipboard full of official-looking documents. We need to discuss some concerns about your property modifications. James had politely explained that his property was outside any HOA jurisdiction. He'd verified this multiple times before purchase. But Evelyn Morrison wasn't deterred by legal technicalities. "You may not be technically within our boundaries," she'd replied with a smile that never reached her eyes, "but your property affects our community's visual aesthetics and property values. We have standards to maintain." Over the following months, those standards had become an escalating campaign of harassment. First came the complaints about his solar panels creating unsightly industrial appearance, then objections to his satellite dish for disrupting the natural mountain landscape. Most recently, she'd demanded he remove the workshop he'd built for his retirement woodworking hobby, claiming it violated environmental preservation guidelines. Each complaint had been thoroughly investigated by actual authorities: county officials, environmental inspectors, forest
Comfortably in the mountains he'd loved since childhood camping trips. But to Evelyn Morrison, he was simply an unwelcome intrusion in what she considered her exclusive mountain community. The fake police at his door weren't just about property violations. They were about sending a message: this mountain doesn't welcome people like you. Inside his cabin, James listened to the escalating threats while his security system recorded everything. His government training kicked in, analyzing the situation with the methodical precision that had made him invaluable to federal cybersecurity operations. The officers weren't just impersonating police, they were doing it badly. Their supposed warrant mentioned violations that didn't exist under Colorado law. Their authority claims referenced agencies that had no jurisdiction over his property. And their aggressive behavior violated every protocol for legitimate law enforcement contact. But most telling of all was their timing. James had received a certified letter just 2 days ago, informing him that his federal pension and security clearance reviews had been completed successfully. Someone had been monitoring his official status, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when they thought he was most vulnerable. They had no idea how wrong they were. James opened his laptop and accessed a secure communication system he'd hoped never to use in retirement. His fingers flew across the encrypted keyboard, sending a priority message to contacts who represented the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in the United States. "This is James Carter, badge number 2847, reporting federal impersonation and intimidation incident, requesting immediate backup at coordinates 39.7392, 15 to 11. Suspects impersonating law enforcement officers. Pattern suggests organized harassment targeting federal retiree." The response came back within More importantly, his remote mountain cabin wasn't as isolated as it appeared. The advanced security system he'd installed wasn't just for personal protection. It was connected to federal monitoring networks that had been tracking the unusual activity around his property for weeks. Every threat, every intimidation attempt, every illegal action taken against him had been automatically documented and transmitted to databases that Evelyn Morrison and her fake cops couldn't begin to comprehend. The sound of helicopters in the distance made James smile for the first time in months. His backup was arriving, and it wasn't local sheriff's deputies or state police. It was the full weight of federal law enforcement, and they were about to educate some very surprised criminals about the difference between fake authority and real power. The fake officers outside his door were about to discover that they'd picked the wrong target for their intimidation tactics. James Carter had spent 3 decades protecting his country from sophisticated threats. A couple of wannabe cops with rented uniforms were about to learn what happened when civilians tried to intimidate someone with connections that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. The helicopters were getting closer, and James could see vehicles moving up the mountain road through his security monitors. Evelyn Morrison's carefully orchestrated harassment campaign was about to collide with the reality of federal law enforcement, and the results would be spectacular. But what James didn't yet realize was that this confrontation would expose something far bigger than simple HOA harassment. The investigation that was about to unfold would reveal a network of corruption, intimidation, and civil rights violations that stretched across multiple states. The first helicopter to appear over the ridge wasn't the FBI helicopter James was expecting. It was black, unmarked, and moving with the kind of precision that made his blood run cold. Through his advanced security monitors, he watched 3 more similar aircraft approaching from different directions, their rotors cutting through the mountain air like mechanical predators. This wasn't a standard federal response. This was something much bigger. The fake cops outside his door had gone silent, their aggressive shouting replaced by confused whispers as they spotted the approaching aircraft. Through his window, James could see them fumbling with radio equipment, their fake authority crumbling in the face of real power descending from the sky. His encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number he hadn't seen in 5 years. The caller ID simply read, "Director." "Carter," he answered, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around his cabin. "James, this is Director Sarah Chen, FBI Cyber Division. We need to talk, immediately." James's heart skipped a beat. Director Chen had been his liaison during his final years of government service, but their contact had ended when he retired. Her involvement now meant this situation was far beyond simple HOA harassment. "Director, I'm dealing with what appears to be impersonation of law enforcement officers." "James, stop talking. Listen carefully." Chen's voice carried the weight of national security urgency. "The individuals at your location aren't just fake cops. They're part of a domestic terrorism network we've been tracking for 18 months. Your harassment wasn't random. You were specifically targeted because of your security clearance and the classified information you handled during your career." The world tilted sideways for James Carter. This wasn't about HOA standards or mountain aesthetics. This was about national security. "The woman who's been harassing you, Evelyn Morrison, is connected to a group calling itself the Patriots Preservation Alliance. They've been systematically targeting retired federal employees, especially minorities with high-level clearances, trying to intimidate them into relocating or providing information about their former work." Through his window, James watched the fake cops backing away from his door as the helicopters began landing in his meadow. But their retreat wasn't panicked. It was coordinated, professional. These weren't amateur criminals in rented uniforms. They were part of something far more dangerous. "Director, how long have you been monitoring my situation?" "Since your 3rd complaint to local authorities. Your name triggered automatic alerts in our system when you reported harassment by individuals with suspected extremist connections." Chen paused, and James could hear helicopter rotors in the background of her call. "James, we need you to stay exactly where you are. What's about to happen is going to look intense, but you're completely safe. We've been using your situation to draw out the entire network." The revelation hit James like a physical blow. He'd been bait. His retirement cabin, his peaceful mountain sanctuary, his months of harassment, all of it had been orchestrated by federal agents using him as an unwitting asset in a counter-terrorism operation. "The fake police outside your door are carrying weapons, James, real weapons. They weren't planning to just intimidate you today. Based on intercepted communications, they were planning to escalate to violence if you didn't comply with their demands for information about your former work." Outside, black-clad figures were rappelling from the helicopters with military precision. These weren't local FBI agents. This was the federal government's most elite, tactical.
Face down, in his yard, zip-tied and surrounded by operators who made them look like children playing dress-up. But the biggest shock was yet to come. "James, there's something else you need to know. Evelyn Morrison isn't just connected to this terrorist network. She's one of its primary recruiters. Her community standards campaigns across Colorado have been identifying federal employees, military veterans, and other targets for systematic harassment and information gathering. Through his security monitors, James watched a familiar figure being led away from a concealed position in the tree line. Evelyn Morrison, the woman who had spent months complaining about his solar panels and satellite dish, was wearing tactical gear and communication equipment. She wasn't some busybody HOA president. She was a domestic terrorist. "How many people like me?" James asked quietly. 17 that we know of. Retired federal employees, former military officers, cybersecurity specialists, all minorities, all with high-level clearances, all harassed by groups claiming to represent community standards or property values. Chen's voice was grim. 3 of them were successfully intimidated into providing classified information. 2 others suffered what appeared to be accidents after refusing to cooperate. The implications were staggering. James had thought he was dealing with suburban racism disguised as property management. In reality, he'd stumbled into a sophisticated domestic terrorism operation targeting America's most sensitive national security assets. The reason we couldn't tell you what was happening is that we needed the network to believe their operation was succeeding. Your responses, your complaints to authorities, your attempts to handle this through legal channels, all of it was exactly what a real target would do. James watched through his windows as FBI agents
methodically searched the fake police vehicle, removing weapons, communication equipment, and what appeared to be surveillance gear. The scope of the operation surrounding his simple mountain cabin was mind-boggling. "James, in about 10 minutes, Agent Rodriguez is going to knock on your door. She's going to ask you some very specific questions about your time in cybersecurity, about any approaches you've received for information, about any unusual contacts or communications you've experienced since retirement. And after that? After that, you testify before a federal grand jury. Your harassment becomes evidence in the largest domestic terrorism prosecution in Colorado history, and Evelyn Morrison and her entire network spend the rest of their lives in federal prison." As James hung up the phone, he realized that his quiet mountain retirement had just ended. But in its place, he'd been given something far more significant: the chance to protect other veterans and federal employees from the network that had targeted him. The fake cops had come to his cabin thinking they were intimidating an isolated retiree. Instead, they'd walked into a federal trap that would destroy their entire organization. But the most satisfying part was knowing that Evelyn Morrison, who thought she could terrorize him into submission, was about to discover what real federal authority looked like when it decided to protect one of its own. The federal command center that materialized in James Carter's meadow within an hour looked like something from a military operation. Satellite communication arrays stretched toward the sky while dozens of agents coordinated what was clearly a multi-state takedown operation. James sat in his own living room, watching through his windows as his peaceful cabin became the nerve center for what Director Chen was calling Operation Mountain Justice. Agent Maria Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes investigations, sat across from James with a tablet full of evidence that would have terrified him 6 months ago. Now, it just made him angry. "Mr. Carter, we need you to understand the scope of what you've helped us uncover," Rodriguez began, swiping through photographs that showed surveillance equipment, weapons caches, and detailed dossiers on federal employees across 6 states. The Patriots Preservation Alliance wasn't just harassing you, they were building toward something much worse. The tablet screen showed a map dotted with red pins, each representing a targeted federal employee. James's location sat at the center of a web that stretched from Colorado to California, from Texas to Montana. 17 pins marked confirmed targets, 7 more marked employees who had died in accidents after refusing to cooperate with information requests. Evelyn Morrison has been running this operation for 3 years, Rodriguez continued. Her method was ingenious: use fake community standards and HOA pressure to isolate federal employees, then escalate to intimidation when legal harassment failed. The fake police today were step 3 in a 4-step process. James didn't want to ask, but he had to know. What was step 4? Elimination. Rodriguez's voice was flat, professional, devastating. We have intercepted communications planning your murder if you didn't provide access to classified cybersecurity protocols. They weren't just trying to scare you, Mr. Carter. They were planning to kill you and make it look like a home invasion. The weight of that revelation settled over James like mountain snow, cold, heavy, and suffocating. For 6 months, he'd thought he was dealing with suburban racism and property disputes. In reality, he'd been targeted for assassination by domestic terrorists who viewed him as both a security threat and a source of valuable intelligence. Outside, James could see Evelyn Morrison in federal custody, her silver hair disheveled, her authoritative demeanor replaced by the confused terror of someone who had underestimated her opposition. She was surrounded by evidence bags containing weapons, communication equipment, and what appeared to be detailed surveillance reports on his daily routine. "How did I not see this coming?" James asked, the cybersecurity specialist in him, ashamed at missing such an obvious threat. "Because you were thinking like a retiree dealing with a neighborhood dispute, not like a federal target under surveillance by trained operatives," Rodriguez replied. Morrison's network included former military, discharged law enforcement officers, and private security contractors. They knew how to conduct surveillance, how to plan operations, and how to exploit the gaps between local and federal jurisdiction. Agent Rodriguez showed him another screen displaying communication intercepts that made his blood run cold. The fake cops hadn't just come to intimidate him. They'd come equipped with torture devices, drugs for forced interrogation, and clean-up materials for disposing of evidence afterward. "Mr. Carter, your security system didn't just record harassment. It documented premeditation for kidnapping, torture, and murder in furtherance of domestic terrorism. Every complaint you filed, every official report you made, created a paper trail that proves this was systematic targeting of a federal employee." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Morrison's knees. Twerk had infiltrated HOA boards across multiple states, specifically targeting communities where federal employees lived. They'd used property management companies, private security contractors, and corrupt local officials to create a pipeline for identifying and harassing targets. But the most chilling revelation was still to come. "James," Rodriguez said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "they didn't just target you because you're black. They targeted you because of what you knew about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in federal systems. They were specifically trying to obtain information about national infrastructure protection protocols." The implications crashed over James like an avalanche. This wasn't just domestic terrorism. It was espionage. Foreign adversaries were using American extremist groups to target retired federal employees for intelligence gathering. His harassment had been funded by enemies of the United States who wanted access to the most sensitive cybersecurity information in the government. Who was paying them? Rodriguez hesitated, then showed him a financial chart that traced money flows from shell companies to offshore accounts to domestic terrorist cells. "We're still unraveling it, but preliminary evidence suggests Russian intelligence services were funding these operations. Your harassment was essentially a Russian intelligence operation disguised as American racism." James felt the full weight of 30 years in government service settling on his shoulders. He'd spent his career protecting America's digital infrastructure from foreign threats, only to be targeted by those same threats after his retirement. The irony was bitter, but the danger was real. What happens now? Now you testify. Your evidence, combined with the federal investigation we've been conducting, is going to destroy this entire network. Morrison, her fake cops, and 17 other operatives across 6 states are facing federal terrorism charges, espionage charges, and attempted murder charges. Through his window, James watched FBI agents loading evidence bags into helicopters while forensic teams processed his cabin like a crime scene. His peaceful mountain retreat had become ground zero for a counter-terrorism operation that would reshape how America protected its retired federal employees. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. "James, there's one more thing. The president wants to meet with you. Your willingness to stand your ground, your insistence on following proper legal channels, your refusal to be intimidated. It saved not just your life, but potentially the lives of dozens of other federal employees who were being similarly targeted." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, James Carter realized that his retirement had ended the moment those fake cops knocked on his door. But in its place, he'd been given something far more important. The knowledge that even in retirees meant he was still serving his country, still protecting the institutions and people who kept America safe. The fake cops had come to his cabin thinking they were terrorizing an isolated retiree. Instead, they'd triggered the investigation that would destroy the entire network, threatening America's national security assets. Justice was coming, and it was wearing FBI jackets. 6 months later, James Carter stood before the federal district court in Denver, wearing his best suit and carrying a folder thick with evidence that would put domestic terrorists behind bars for life. The courtroom was packed with FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and families of the federal employees who had been targeted by the Patriots Preservation Alliance network. In the defendants section, Evelyn Morrison sat in an orange jumpsuit, her silver hair now grey with stress, her imperious demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of someone facing multiple life sentences. Beside her, the 2 fake cops who had threatened his cabin looked like small-town criminals who had stumbled into federal court by mistake. They had no idea what they'd really been part of. The prosecution's case had unraveled a conspiracy that shocked even seasoned counterterrorism investigators. 17 federal employees targeted, 4 murdered, millions of dollars in Russian funding, a network that stretched across 6 states and included dozens of American citizens willing to sell out their country for money and ideology. James's testimony was the centerpiece of the government's case. His security recordings, his documentation of harassment, his professional responses to intimidation, all of it painted a picture of systematic terrorism targeting America's most valuable national security assets. "Mr. Carter," the lead prosecutor asked during his final questions, "what would have happened if you had given them the information they wanted?" James looked directly at Evelyn Morrison as he answered. Critical vulnerabilities in America's cybersecurity infrastructure would have been exposed to foreign adversaries. Power grids could have been compromised. Financial systems could have been attacked. American lives would have been endangered. The sentencing was swift and merciless. Morrison received life in prison without parole for domestic terrorism, espionage, and conspiracy to commit murder. Her fake cops received 25 years each. The entire network that had terrorized federal retirees across 6 states was dismantled and imprisoned. But the real victory came afterward, in the policy changes that James's case had inspired. The Federal Retiree Protection Act, signed into law just weeks after the trial, established new protocols for protecting retired federal employees with high-level security clearances. Automatic monitoring systems would flag harassment patterns, rapid response teams would investigate suspicious activities, and federal resources would be dedicated to ensuring that America's retired national security professionals could live in peace without fear of terrorism or intimidation. Standing on his cabin's porch that evening, James watched the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and purple. The security equipment had been upgraded even further, but now it felt protective rather than necessary. The Forest Service had assigned a permanent ranger to patrol the area. The FBI had established a field office in the nearest town. His phone buzzed with a text from Director Chen. Congressional hearings scheduled for next month. They want to create a new division focused on protecting retired federal employees interested in consulting work. James smiled as he typed back, "Semper Fi to the Constitution, Director. Send me the details." His daughter called just as the stars began appearing in the mountain sky. "Dad, I saw the news coverage of the sentencing. How are you holding up?" "I'm good, sweetheart," James replied, settling into the rocking chair he'd built in his workshop, the same workshop Evelyn Morrison had demanded he remove. "I'm actually better than good. I'm useful again." "What do you mean?" James looked out over his 20 acres of protected land, thinking about the federal employees across the country who could now live without fear of the kind of harassment he'd endured. "I mean, I got to serve my country one more time. And this time, I helped make sure other people like me won't have to go through what I went through." As he hung up the phone, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a retired cybersecurity specialist looking for peace in the mountains. Tonight, he was a national hero whose courage had exposed and destroyed a domestic terrorism network targeting America's most valuable national security assets. The fake cops had thought they were intimidating an isolated retiree. Instead, they'd awakened a patriot whose love for his country ran deeper than their hatred could reach. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and the promise of peaceful tomorrows, but James Carter knew that his real retirement would have to wait. America still needed him, and he would answer the call as long as he drew breath. Some battles choose the warrior. This one had chosen wisely.